Yeah,
Okay.
One. Perfect.
Fire away.
Fire. Welcome to Casual Politics.
Thank you. Casual. I'm enjoying that word. Casual. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You need no introduction, George Galloway. You've been a member of Parliament since 1987, and then you became a leading member of a Respect Party. Eventually, you also you were a leader, and you are still a leader since 2004. So my first question is, how did you get involved in politics?
I was born into politics, really. My parents were political activists. My grandparents, to some extent, also. And so it was as natural as mother's milk to me. I was the kid in the class at school who always knew who the Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia was, who the President of Uganda was, and so on. So politics was always discussed around my breakfast table, and I never had any doubt at any time in my life that I would live a political life. And by the grace of God, I've been able to do so. And
what has changed in politics since you've entered in Parliament since 1987?
Well, on one level, a great many things have changed, but on a fundamental level, they remain the same. Let me deal with the fundamental level first. The world is still divided between the rich and powerful and the poor and powerless. Rich countries dominating poor countries, rich people in the rich countries dominating the poor people in their countries, and rich people in the poor countries also dominating and exploiting the poor in their countries. That has not changed. It will not change until the socialist idea comes to pass. The German revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg said almost 100 years ago that the choice facing the world was socialism or barbarism, and I believe that's still the same choice. So that has not changed. What has changed is the stratification of people in class terms, the number of blue-collar, trade-unionized proletarians in Britain and most Western countries. It's obviously very much smaller now than it was when I was born. When I was born, factories employing 10, 15,000 people inside one place, under one roof, in one union, were commonplace. Indeed, my father worked in one, and I later also worked in one. That's no longer the case. Workers are atomized more in different small employers, and oftentimes not involved in trade unions, sometimes not allowed to be in trade unions. So that's a big change. When I was born, 98% of the people in 1955, so when I was one, 98% of the British people voted either Labour or Conservative. Only 2% voted for anyone else. And of course, that's very different now. The two big parties, Labour and the Conservatives, will be lucky to achieve 55% between them. It's not even inconceivable that they'll get 50% between them. And so the plurality of the British party political scene has vastly changed since I was young. However, you can have a lot of different parties with different names, wearing different colours, but if they are fundamentally the same, they have the same attitude to property, power, imperialism, the things that make my politics tick, then you're as well having 2 or 22, it won't make any real difference.
You talk about plurality of British politics. Now we saw rise of nationalist parties such as NSB in Scotland and UKIP and UKIP. So in what sense it has actually affected your party and overshadowed your party's policies?
Well, it's definitely overshadowed us in the sense that it's easy to sell nationalism, chauvinism, xenophobia, racism. It's easy to sell that to the simple-minded. It's much more difficult to sell the socialist idea to people in the current conditions, current political climate. So Nigel Farage has been much more successful than me, although he's not a member of parliament and I am. And UKIP for a long time had no members of parliament, now have two. But that's because, not necessarily because he's any better than me, but because he's selling something eminently more easy to sell. But it's a false prospectus.
But why it's easier to sell?
Well, because there's a predisposition amongst people in imperial countries like ours to believe that Johnny Foreigner is a problem. Johnny Foreigner over there, or Johnny Foreigner in our midst. You can easily, especially with Rupert Murdoch and the Sun and the Daily Mail and so on at your side, you can easily get the drum beats going. People have real problems in this country, and it's relatively easy to turn their attention to a scapegoat, to a whipping boy that can be blamed for these problems. In the past, in the 30s, nationalists blamed the Jews. Today's nationalists blame the Muslims, blame the immigrants, blame the blacks, blame the other. Even if that other actually looks just like you, someone from Poland or Latvia, it's relatively easy to turn people's attention to them.
But does your party have a sustainable stance on the EU?
Well, we support the EU. We think it would be a catastrophe for Britain to leave the EU, which is not to say we support how the EU works, how it runs, who leads it, the perspectives that they have. We don't. We oppose all of those. But the idea of a European Union, ever deeper union, ever more profound union, is one that we support. In fact, we wish, don't expect to see it anytime soon, but we would wish for a United States of Europe, which we think is the way forward for all regions of the world. A united African states, a united Arab states, a united Latin American states, and a united European states. That's the way forward.
But as you've always been a leading orator in British politics, also conservatives like Sir Peter Tapsell, they always said. So have you ever requested a debate with Nigel Farage?
Yes, I've been pursuing him publicly for a debate for a long time. In fact, I think we could sell out the Albert Hall. And I've proposed to him, let's do it. Let's take the Albert Hall, fill it, raise a vast amount of money for your party and ours. We'll split the proceeds. But he's not accepting my challenge because I think he realizes that he'd get a much tougher time from me and from any of the other political leaders.
Before going to Middle East, as you are an expert on Middle East, just last question, British politics, is that now David Cameron said that he would dock the TV debates leadership. So, but some people already said no. If the Green Party are not included in those debates, so if we actually include the Green Party in those debates as well, would you like your party to be in those debates?
Well, we'll take a legal action to stop the debates if we're not, because the Greens have one member of Parliament and so do we. And moreover, I've been elected 6 times to Parliament, and the Green MP's been elected once. I've been elected as a Respect MP twice. The Green Party MP has been elected once. I've been in Parliament almost 30 years. She's been in for almost 5. So there's no argument at all in our view. If you're going to have the Greens in the debate, then you have to have us. And I pray to God over and over to be included in such debates, because I think that we would win them.
And now, on the Middle East, you became very familiar figure to the public of your infamous statement to Saddam Hussein when you said, "I salute your courage." So at that time, did you think that was it the only leader who could stand up to West?
I wasn't actually addressing him with those remarks. I was addressing the people of Iraq as a whole, and I have explained that many hundreds of times, so you'll have to forgive me if I excuse myself from doing so all over again. I was not a supporter of Saddam Hussein. I was an opponent of Saddam Hussein when British and American governments and business people were doing a roaring trade with Saddam Hussein. For example, I was one of the few opponents of Saddam's attack against Iran. I was on Iran's side in the war. I believed that building up a dictator like Saddam Hussein would backfire, just like the building up of Al-Qaeda types all over the world has turned out to backfire. Another of the predictions that we made. But when it came to starving to death hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children by sanction, still more when it came to hundreds of thousands of Western soldiers invading and occupying Iraq, we stood with Iraq.
And since 2003, you've been a leading figure of Stop Coalition War. And so my question is, to what extent do you think that you're being heard? Because in September, the House of Commons voted for the second intervention in Iraq. So are you being heard at all?
Well, the previous year, we stopped not just a British, but thereby a British and American attack on Syria under the pretext of, believe it or not, weapons of mass destruction. We defeated the government by 13 votes in the chamber. That was a very significant victory, and was a victory not just for our parliamentary performance and tactics, though that was impressive, I think, but the opposition to war, the skepticism about the case being made for war, the lack of credibility of the British political class and leadership is all directly related to the Stop the War Coalition's long campaign against British involvement in these wars. So you can say we didn't stop the Iraq war, that's true. We probably did stop, not ourselves alone. Of course, the local conditions were not good for it, but we probably did stop British governments committing themselves to further invasions of Syria, of Iran, and even of Iraq. You make the point that Britain is bombing in Iraq again, that's true, but they're not going to send their soldiers there. And so far, they're not prepared to bomb Syria either. So we have placed, if you like, parameters around the British government's ability to act in a way that it might have wanted to act. And I think that's a tribute to the millions in Britain who marched behind our banners.
And you've always said that it's not our war, and it's not our war. We should not go and fight in Syria, in Iraq, or in Libya, and because it's not our fight. So whose war is it? Whose fight is it?
Well, what happens in Libya or Mali is a matter for the Libyans and the Malians. I give those two just as an example. The British have no right whatsoever to dictate the outcome of political conflict or struggle inside these countries. We have a right to defend ourselves against any attack that comes against us from them or anyone. We have a right to defend the rights of British citizens to go about their lawful business and so on. But we don't have the right to interfere in other people's countries. And this is an imperial hangover. No one in Norway sits at night wondering what they should do in Mogadishu or in Mongolia. They rightly have concluded that that's really not their business. The problem is the British haven't wholly concluded that it's not their business. From the 19th century, Britain has been invading and occupying and looting other people's countries. And it's got to stop. Sometimes they dress it up in evangelical clothes or humanitarian clothes. But as the Archbishop Desmond Tutu put it, they came here with their rifle in one hand and their Bible in the other. They taught us to pray with our eyes closed, and when we opened them, they'd stolen our country. That's the role of imperialism, and that's been the role of Britain in the imperialist age. So you ask me whose war is it? Not ours. Neighbours can sometimes have, and I argue this in my book that I see you have, I'm not the only one, I argue the conditions that would need to be present before intervention by anyone in conflicts abroad would be legitimate. And they are this. If a conflict inside a country has spilled over into neighbouring countries, clearly the neighbouring country has a right, maybe a duty to intervene. I'll give you two examples. Julius Nyerere, God rest his soul, when he was the leader of Tanzania, invaded Uganda and brought down Idi Amin, the dictator there, who had declared himself the last king of Scotland and who had massacred the local people. But his massacres were beginning to impact on Tanzania. And so Nyerere was right to invade. A second example was when Vietnam invaded Cambodia in order to destroy the unbelievably extreme government of Pol Pot and the so-called Khmer Rouge. You may or may not know that Britain and the United States continued to recognize the Khmer Rouge, to recognize Pol Pot, and insist that he kept his United Nations membership and seat at the United Nations. They don't like to remember that now, but the Vietnamese armed forces were right to intervene in Cambodia and bring down the Khmer Rouge regime because Vietnam was being affected by the nihilistic genocide that Pol Pot had unleashed in neighbouring Cambodia. So I'm not saying I'm against intervention in all circumstances. There are very few, if any, circumstances in which it can be right or productive or successful for the big imperial powers to return to the scenes of their former crimes. But sometimes there are grounds for neighbours to combine, the African Union being a very good example, where a conflict is causing havoc in neighbouring countries. But there are three conditions that have to be satisfied. First, the action has to be lawful. Second, it has to be proportionate. And third, it must do less harm than not intervening. Now, on those three counts, all of Britain's recent, by which I mean over the last 20, 25 years, all of Britain's recent military interventions in other countries have been not just unlawful, not just counterproductive, but have caused a multitude of other problems that didn't exist before.
And you said that it's up to their neighbours to fight this war. But for example, I take Saudi Arabia as example. Mm-hmm. They've got five planes, because Michael Portillo, when he was the defense secretary, he sold to Saudi Arabia 2 fight planes, but they haven't taken any actions to fight terrorism.
Well, Saudi Arabia is deeply implicated in the whole ISIS story. The Takfiri Wahhabist mentality, which keeps them going, which is their fuel, is an export of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabians, maybe not the state, maybe individuals, although where one stops and the other begins is a moot point, has been responsible for the early funding of Al-Qaeda and its offshoots. Al-Qaeda itself was founded by a Saudi, Osama bin Laden. Saudi Arabia's fear of, hatred of its neighbors is a fundamental part of this narrative. And it seems to me that Saudi Arabia can only dispel the widely held suspicion that they and ISIS are one and the same by decisively intervening to defeat them. Their neighbor, Iraq, if it is overrun by ISIS, which is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, then Saudi Arabia will be next. So they have every incentive to become involved, but they're not involved. There are no Saudi soldiers helping the Iraqis to defeat ISIS. As far as I know, there are no Saudi airplanes in the air bombing ISIS. If there are, they're almost certainly in Syria rather than in Iraq. So Saudi Arabia should be held to account. 13 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11 were Saudi citizens. None of them were Iranian, none of them were Iraqi, none of them were Afghans. 13 of the 19 were Saudis. And bin Laden's family, as many now know, were hurriedly facilitated in their exit from the United States in the 2-3 days after the mass murder of 9/11. So Saudi Arabia is a deeply sinister entity with a dark past, and our ongoing productive, profitable relationship with it is a very, very dark mark and stain on the reputation of our own country.
Only 2 last questions on the Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris. I know that we can't ignore those attacks. So would you condemn those attacks that occurred in Paris and those provocations? And would you say that...
I'm rather offended that you should ask me that question. What sane person would not condemn the cold-blooded murder of unarmed people, the murder of police officers, 3 of them, the murder of shoppers in a kosher supermarket in Paris? These are despicable acts of cold-blooded mass murder. They are crimes, and as the people involved in them claim to be religious, it's worth pointing out they're not just crimes, they are sins. They are mortal sins for which the perpetrator will surely receive condign punishment on the Judgment Day.
And do you think that, do you agree that they say multiculturalism has failed, especially in this country?
Well, I'm not sure there is multiculturalism. It's a straw man that's erected in order to knock it down. Anyone who's walked around the poor suburbs of Paris and seen the teeming poverty in which the immigrant families and the immigrant population live, anyone who's experienced the racism of the French CRS, the riot police, anyone who has lived in France and been from a minority ethnic community knows that multiculturalism is not quite the way you would describe living as a black or Muslim or even worse, black Muslim person in France. Look, we have no alternative. There is no choice involved in this. We are all mixed together in all these countries. We cannot extirpate, even if we wanted to, any of the minorities that live in our midst. So we have no choice but to get along in a harmonious way, and that means an end to bigotry and discrimination and racism. London, for example, has the minorities are the majority in London. 53% of the population of London are from the minority ethnic communities. So we have a right for that to be reflected in the police force, in the political class, in the media, and so on. So far, it is not. There's a problem in Britain with racism, but if you think Britain is racist, you've never lived in France.
And do you think that we should, you talk about harmony, do you think that we should all unite alongside each other, Muslims, Jews, Catholics, and Christians, to combat extremism?
Well, Catholics are Christians too, so there's no need for that false dichotomy. Of course, extremism of any kind is despicable. Jewish extremists, Christian extremists, Muslim extremists are all peddling a philosophy of despair, a counsel of despair. And if we don't defeat them, they will tear us apart and we'll all be sunk. I'm encouraged that most Muslims, most Christians, and most Jews turn their back on that kind of extremism.
And my last question, how do you foresee the future of the United Kingdom as a whole after the Scottish referendum?
Well, there's a real danger of the state breaking apart. If, God forbid, the Conservatives were to be re-elected, for example, in May for another 5 years, there would almost certainly be another referendum on a Scottish breakaway, and it would almost certainly be lost. And then Britain would no longer exist as a state. Now, there are some who find that proposition attractive. I don't myself, because what would happen is that the English state that would remain would continue to play the pernicious, perfidious role which the British state has played. The English state would carry on playing that role. It would still have a seat on the Security Council. It would still be a nuclear armed power. It would still be in NATO. It would still be a key American ally. All these things would continue, so nothing would be gained in that regard. But the state, the English state that would be left behind, would be almost certainly a perpetually right-wing state. And it would create an economic environment for private profit, capitalism, that the Scottish state would have to replicate or die, because no one's going to locate their business in a high tax, high regulation, social democratic Scotland if they can do so in the opposite conditions in England. So there would then be a race to the bottom with Scotland and England in a Dutch auction of how many regulations they could burn, how many taxes they could cut, how they could make life even easier for exploiters. And as each did, the other would respond, and before long you'd have the lowest regulation, lowest tax, lowest public services that it's possible to imagine. So I hope that Britain will not break up, but there's a real danger that it will.
Thank you, George Galloway, for
Welcome.
the clarity in all of your answers.
Pleasure.
I'm very grateful to you. Thank
Pleasure.
you very much.
Thank you.